Concept 34.4 has our next group of creatures called gnathostomes. The G is silent. Gnathostomes are vertebrates that have jaws. Today, jawed vertebrates or gnathostomes outnumber jawless vertebrates. So there's only a few different types of jawless vertebrates still around. They would have been more plentiful back in the early days of the development of the vertebrates, but now jawed vertebrates make up the majority. Gnathostomes include sharks and all of their relatives, ray-finned fishes, which are the fish that you're probably familiar with when you think of fish, lobe-finned fishes, which are weird little guys we'll talk about, amphibians, reptiles, which would include birds, by the way, and mammals, of course, and that would include human beings as well. Again, with each category of creature, we want to kind of talk about what makes them unique or different. Gnathostomes, as we already mentioned, have jaws that might have evolved from skeletal supports of the pharyngeal slits. So this is kind of the what they think was the evolutionary path. You would have had these basic skeletal components of the pharyngeal slits, like this would be the gill slits of the fish, and they would have over time evolved into more complex components that would have begun to make up the mouth and the jaw of the creature. Other characters common to gnathostomes would include, again, genome duplication, including duplication of Hox genes. So once again, we have some variation in the genetics going on. We have some duplication, which would be a form of a mutation. This one happened to have been a beneficial mutation. An enlarged forebrain associated with enhanced smell and vision. So we have an even larger skull and brain, and that would allow for greater complexity in the ability to take in information. In aquatic gnathostomes, the lateral line system, in certain fish and sharks and rays, they have what's called a lateral line system. That's a row of organs, or an organ that forms a row along the side of their body, which makes them able to pick up vibrations in the water around them. And lots of these aquatic gnathostomes, the jawed fish and the like, they use this lateral line system for them to detect when predators or prey are around. Some of the earliest gnathostomes in the fossil record are no longer around. They're an extinct lineage of armored vertebrates, some scary looking guys called placoderms. They appeared in the Ordovician period about 450 million years ago. This guy right here, I'll show you a bigger picture. This is a fossil of an early gnathostone. None of these guys are still around, but take a look at this skull and these jaws, and this would have been a pretty fearsome looking creature. And the textbook talks about how a 2006 analysis of the jaw structure concluded that this particular creature, whose name looks to be Dunkleostis, this guy, Dunkleostis, could have exerted a force of about 8,000 pounds per square inch at the tip of its jaws. So I wouldn't want to have been caught in the jaws of this creature. It would have been a pretty frightful looking guy right there. So another group of jawed vertebrates called acanthodians. Again, these words, they kill me too, and I say them more often than you guys do. Acanthodians, I'm going to have to look that one up, rated during the Silurian and the Devonian periods, 444 to about 359 million years ago. So these acanthodians were also another group of jawed vertebrates that were around during these periods of Silurian and Devonian. Both of these groups, the placoderms and the acanthodians, eventually died out, but from those there were three lineages that survived all the way up into the present day. This would be the sharks and the rays, the ray-finned fish, which would be most of the fish you think about, bass and catfish and perch and well, pretty much most of the fish you think about. And then some pretty odd creatures called lobe-finned fishes. We'll take a look at those. These guys are probably most related to some of the ancestors that eventually became the tetrapod, the land-dwelling creatures. You'll notice there's no mention of like reptiles and birds and mammals, because we are actually descendants from fish. So we're going to find out that we are descendants of one of these lineages of jawed vertebrates. So first we're going to look at the chondrichthyans. The chondrichthyans are the sharks and the rays. The ray-finned fishes are the fish that you are most familiar with, and then the lobe-finned fish, we'll take a look at those as well. So let's start with the chondrichthyans, which would be the sharks and the rays. Sharks, rays, and their various relatives. Chondrichthyans have a skeleton composed primarily of cartilage, so they do have a skeletal system, but it's not really mineralized. It's more like the soft cartilage or the softer material, say, of your nose. If you reach up and touch your nose, you can wiggle it around. It's more flexible than bone, but it can be fairly stiff as well. The largest and most diverse group of chondrichthyans includes the sharks and the rays and the skates, which you're probably familiar with those guys. We have some videos within the notes folder of Chapter 34. I don't think every video is put in there, but I tried to put in at least about 10 different videos, so you can look for those. Various videos of sharks and other manta rays and other cool creatures. So let's take a look at some of those guys. This would be the chondrichthyans, chondrichthyes, which would be the group here. So we have creatures like a reef shark and stingrays, and there's something called a ratfish, which is slightly different from some of the others. Briefly, we'll take a quick look at them. A second subclass is composed of a few dozen species of ratfish. So there is this one subclass that's not the sharks and the rays, but it's called a ratfish. Not as common, kind of a subclass of these chondrichthyans, which would be these the vertebrates with a jaw that came from these three major groups that we were talking about, from the three lineages of jawed vertebrates, the chondrichthyans being the one we're looking at right now. So sharks have a streamlined body, swift swimmers. You're probably familiar with some of them at least. The largest sharks, such as whale sharks and basking sharks, are actually suspension feeders. They're not actually meat eaters. They don't attack, fish or seals like great white sharks. The largest of these sharks are more like the large whales, where they feed on tiny little plankton and other floating creatures within the water. Sharks have a fairly short digestive tract, with a ridge called the spiral valve to kind of increase the digestive surface area. Sharks have very acute senses, a very good sense of sight, smell, the ability to detect electrical fields from nearby animals. Supposedly they can detect blood in the water from quite some distance. They can detect floundering fish or injured fish, and they can detect movement from quite some distance as well. So very efficient predators, very efficient hunters as well. Another interesting fact about sharks is they don't really have the type of swim bladder that a lot of the regular fish that we're going to look at have, so they have a problem staying buoyant within the water. A lot of sharks, when they stop swimming or stop moving, they basically sink to the bottom of the water, and they need to sort of keep in motion because they need to have water flowing through and over their gills, basically, to breathe. Now there are some sharks and rays that stay on the bottom and sit still for quite some time, but they'll use various muscles to kind of keep water flowing over their gills. But for the most part, sharks stay on the move quite a bit to keep this water continuously flowing through and over their gills, because they're not neutrally buoyant. They will tend to sink toward the bottom if they stop moving around. Sharks have a couple different ways of reproducing. Shark eggs are fertilized internally, so they do have sexual reproduction, and then when they do reproduce, the eggs are fertilized inside the mother shark, but then the embryos can develop in a couple of different ways. There's what's called oviparous. Oviparous means the eggs hatch outside the mother's body. So after the eggs are fertilized, she then lays them, and those eggs hatch outside of the body. There's ovoviparous. Ovoviviparous, too many V's in there. Ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous means the embryo develops within the uterus and is nourished by the egg yolk. And so the baby develops inside the mother, but in an enclosed egg that's not connected to the mother. And finally we have viviparous, and viviparous means the embryo develops more like you would think of a mammal, where the embryo develops within the uterus and is nourished by a yolk sac that is attached to the mother through a placenta. So we have oviparous. My gosh, I'm going to have struggle with all these V's. Oviparous, meaning again the eggs hatch outside of the mother's body. They're fertilized internally, but she lays those eggs and they're hatched outside of the mother's body. And then we have ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous means they develop inside the mother's body, but within an enclosed egg, not attached to the mother's body. And then viviparous. Viviparous means they are more like a mammal in that they develop inside the mother and they are attached to the mother, nourished by the mother through a placenta. The reproductive tract, excretory system, and digestive tract empty into one common opening called a cloaca, very similar to like a bird that has one single opening for all of the various organs, reproductive tract and excretory and urinary system. So all of that is one single opening to the outside world called a cloaca. So the chondrichthyans were the sharks and rays and those guys. And next we have the largest group of vertebrates. The vast majority of vertebrates belong to a clade of gnathostomes called osteichthyes. Osteichthyes is the fish that you're familiar with, as well as all the tetrapods. So included in this category are fish like perch and catfish, but also included in this category called osteichthyes is this major category of vertebrates that would include all the tetrapods, which would be, say, everything from cattle to dogs to humans. Nearly all of the osteichthyans have a bony endoskeleton, so they have like an internal skeleton. Osteichthyans include the bony fish and tetrapods, land animals. Aquatic osteichthyans are the vertebrates we informally call fish, and what this means is that you are descended from a fish. You are in the same category as a fish. So here is this group. So we'll kind of go down the list and kind of get to some of these particulars. Again, I would not expect you to remember all of these names, but just kind of remember some of the basic categories and how they are separated out. Most fish breathe by drawing water over gills, protected by a structure called the operculum, and fish control their buoyancy with an air sac known as a swim bladder. Now remember I said sharks have a tendency to sink to the bottom when they stop moving. Most fish do not. Most fish can kind of move not only forward and reverse, left and right, but they can also float up or down in the water by adjusting the amount of air within what they call their swim bladder. Most fish have a lateral line system, which allows them to recognize vibrations around them to kind of indicate predator and prey. And most species of fish are oviparous, meaning they have eggs that hatch outside the mother's body. There are a few that have internal fertilization and birthing, but most of them lay their eggs outside the body and the eggs hatch that way. So here's your basic fish. This is the anatomy of a trout, which is a common ray-finned fish that you might be familiar with. So they have a lot of the same body parts that you and I have. They have gills, of course, instead of lungs. This is the edge, the protective edge of the operculum that protects the gills there. They have a well-developed brain and spinal cord. Here's their swim bladder, which they can kind of adjust the amount of air within that so they rise and fall within the water level if they want to go higher or go lower. And then they have a lot of the same parts you and I have: kidneys, heart, liver, stomach. Of course, it doesn't always look exactly the same, and it's of course smaller, but they have a lot of the same things. The major category of the osteichthyans would be the ray-finned fish. I'm not even going to ask you to try to remember the official scientific name there, but the ray-finned fish, named for, you can look at their fins and see it looks like rays coming off there. They originated during the Silurian periods about 444 to 460 million years ago, and these fins, supported mainly by these long flexible rays that you see running through them, are modified for everything from maneuvering to defense and other functions. So you think about like a sailfish that has that huge back dorsal fin, or you think about, say, all variety of fish that have different shapes of fins for either fast swimming or for doing various things. So much like the other limbs of other creatures have evolved and changed to match the environment, the fins of fish have done so too. Sometimes it's for maybe attracting a mate, some of them are maybe for fighting off enemies, all sorts of different variations. Again, there should be some videos within the notes folder. You can check that out. Go take a look at that. So then we have all these variety of fishes, and again with all these variety of different fins, these are all ray-finned fish, so that would include everything from a seahorse to an eel. Here's a lionfish, here's a yellowfin tuna, which is the kind of tuna that you might find in your tuna fish or your tuna steak at the restaurant. So all of these are ray-finned fishes. The last category of the gnathostomes, the vertebrates that have jaws, would be the lobe fins. And the lobe fins have muscular pelvic and pectoral fins, and they originated in the Silurian period as well. There are a few of these more ancient variety of fish still around, but you'll notice they don't look much like the common everyday fish that we think of. Three lineages survive and include the coelacanth, which is a cool story about it, lungfish, and the tetrapods. And the tetrapods would be basically all the land animals that you think of. That would include amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Coelacanths, back to that story about the coelacanths, very odd looking fish. Here he is. He looks like something out of the dinosaur age or the fossils from long ago. Coelacanths were thought to have become extinct 75 million years ago, but back in 1938 a living coelacanth was caught off the coast of South Africa, and it became this huge story. People couldn't believe, scientists couldn't believe that this creature was still around, and since then we have found more examples in various areas. So you can see here's a diver swimming near this coelacanth. But the coelacanth is a good example of a lobe-finned fish. You can see that their fins are almost like little legs, little limbs, and they kind of move them more like a creature that walks on the land than a fish. So they kind of paddle around with these fins that are very much arm-like, much more arm-like than a regular fish. Creatures very much like this coelacanth or these lobe-finned fish would have the ancient variety of this guy, the common ancestor many millions of years ago, would have led to the tetrapods. And the tetrapods are where we're going next. Tetrapods are gnathostomes that have limbs. So these are creatures that have a vertebrae and jaws, and they have limbs. So that's where we're headed next. That'll lead us into like amphibians and reptiles and mammals. Let's take a break and we'll come back with the tetrapods.